Tara is an associate professor of English at the University of Oregon and an affiliated faculty member of the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, the Center for the Study of Women in Society, and the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. She got her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, and her BA from Wesleyan. And I should interject that I tried to recruit her to come to Brown's PhD program in English, which when we failed to get her here, but obviously things worked out well for her. Professor Fickle's research and teaching interests include Asian/Asian American culture, game studies, the digital humanities, and comic studies. And her first book, which I'll be talking about today, The Race Card from Gaming Technologies to Model Minorities, which came out from NYU Press in 2019, is the winner of the Before Columbus Foundation's American Book Award. And this book, well, I'll just say this, it explores how games have been used to establish and combat Asian and Asian American racial stereotypes, and she will be telling you more about that. And she's currently working on a digital archive and analysis of the canonical Asian American anthology, i.e., with additional research projects in Chinese gold farming and the racialized dimensions of esports. Her critical and creative work has appeared in modern fiction studies, comparative literature studies, MELIS, and various public humanities portals. And if you go to tarafickle.com, you can find more of her writings. Anyway, I read a good chunk of her book over the weekend, and it is fascinating. And I'm just so looking forward to hearing her talk. Please join me in welcoming Tara to Brown.
Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Dan, I think I can only see you, so I'll just go for your nod. Hi, everyone. I am Tara Fickle. I'm speaking to you from unceded Calapooya territory on the land that we now call Eugene, Oregon, and I'm so excited to be here virtually. I wanted to thank the center, thanks Stephanie and Dr. Leroux for inviting me, to Soraya and other staff for making all this possible. And then of course, thanks to Dan for moderating. As he mentioned, we kind of have a long history, and I am so honored and delighted to be able to have him as an interlocutor. And then of course, thanks to all of you in the audience for making the time to come today. So before I switch to the slides, I thought I'd just kind of give you a really brief roadmap of today's talk. So I'll kind of give an overview of the book's arguments, say a little bit about what it's about, and talk about some of the inspiration for it. And then the second half of the talk will be mostly dedicated to kind of showing you some applications and examples of it to one particular game, Pokemon Go. But the book itself is not all about Pokemon Go, for better or worse. So I'm happy to expand on any of the areas or talk a little bit more about them during the Q&A. So let me switch to the slides. All right, Dan, look good? Can you see it? Can you? Good, all right, thanks. So in the broadest sense, this book really came out of my desire to contest a couple of widespread myths about games. And first of those myths is the idea that they're, what we might call post-racial utopias. Post-racial, or, quote unquote, colorblind, in the sense that your particular identity, your race, your gender, nationality, class, the notion that those don't matter in games, that everyone is kind of equal behind the screen for video games or at the table. And utopian in the sense that games are kind of free of the inequality found in real life. The idea that it's a kind of level playing field for all, a meritocracy where the only thing that matters is how good you are, your skill level, as long as, of course, you follow the rules. And second, utopian in the sense that games are a kind of safe, magical space where you can do whatever you want and be whoever you want to be. And that connects to that kind of post-racial, be whoever you want to be identity level, but also connecting to what we call this idea of the magic circle, where games are functioning like a kind of border or membrane that's protecting you from the real world, in which things that can happen in game can happen precisely because they can't in the real world. And over the last decade, but especially over the last year or so, you've seen a lot of this utopian logic kind of making its way through the media, whether this idea that kind of reality is broken and games can save us, or that games are educational and healthy, or especially over the last year, because it's one of our primary sources of connection and pleasure during a global pandemic. If you play video games regularly, of course, you already know that this utopian post-racial idea is kind of an ill fit with the actual experience, that many video games are in fact immensely toxic, as they say, spaces where racism, sexism, trans and homophobia, xenophobia abound, both in live interactions between players, over voice or chat, but also around, of course, many in-game characters who are most often presented as racialized and sexualized caricatures. And of course, games are rarely safe havens in the sense that violence and domination tend to constitute core game mechanics. The whole purpose of the game is often to kind of hyper-realistically simulate real world violence, war, military intervention. So what this book is first understanding why, given how patently false it is, we continue to cleave to this first myth about games as a kind of idealized utopic version of the real world. And what I found in doing research is this myth, as well as this issue of toxicity, which seems to be very contemporary to the digital space, actually really precedes video games by a significant degree. So I got really curious about how games maybe have been from the beginning in their analog stages, a place where race and inequality actually get perpetuated, but also erased, utopianized, which is why I begin in the book, although I won't talk about it as much today, in the late 19th century, about how gambling was used really effectively to galvanize arguments to end Chinese immigration to the US in the late 19th century. And then also, as I started to do some research into games as race-making spaces, I also encountered this kind of secondary myth, which is the question of sort of why study games at all? They are seen as kind of by definition, these frivolous, simplistic diversions that aren't really worthy of scholarly inquiry. And in some ways, that's arguably why they're allowed to have these kind of offensive retrograde representations, because they're seen as not really mattering, right? This quote, it's just a game. But what I show in the book, and which this growing field of game studies is, I think, been showing, is that really contrary to appearance, games are in fact these highly complex and often quite subtle political technologies that directly participate in many cases in the construction of racial hierarchies. And this happens not just within individual games, but within this whole concept of gaming. And I'll say more about what that means. But just to say now that that whole idea of what we ascribe to games and is really tied up with these ideas of fairness, meritocracy, social mobility, and of course, national identity, which are all of them themselves highly racialized. So this kind of brings me to a statement of the argument of the race card, which is essentially that games can be used as a technology to racialize, in the sense of rendering meaningful this whole social fiction that we call race, but also to rationalize the material and social inequalities that are produced by race. So in other words, because of their form, games are really effective ways of naturalizing inequalities, and by extension, race, by making them seem real, justifiable, inevitable. And so all of this is likely sounding quite abstract. So I wanted to anchor these points through a couple of concrete examples. And this is also talking about the kind of inspiration for the project. So although I think the connection between gaming and racialization has really broad resonances, the inspiration for this book came from thinking about Asian and Asian American culture and history specifically. And that's not just because East Asia, especially Japan, but more recently South Korea and China, have been a really singular force in the history of the video game industry, but also because Asian American literature, I found, was kind of an unexpected place where authors and artists have used gaming to essentially illuminate what it means to be Asian in America. So my interest in games as a way to better understand race came explicitly out of the ways that authors and artists like Maxine Hong Kingston, Hisa Yamamoto, John Okada, Jean Yang, and many, many others have, since the 1940s and 50s, really been defining Asian American experience as a matter of, say, decoding the puzzle of conflicting cultures, distinguishing the real from the fake, learning to play by, quote, American rules as so-called model minorities, or using mahjong, Scrabble, chess, Pac-Man, game theory to dramatize the kind of impossible choices and risks that are demanded by assimilation, or by assertions of national loyalty in wartime, or the way that they present gambling or baseball as alternate modes of national belonging when citizenship proves no match for racism or xenophobia. So examples like these, which I discuss in the book, I think help us explain a really key overlooked way in which Asian Americans get racialized, including the seeming paradox of Asians as both the hardest of workers, but also the most kind of hardcore of players. So for me, that's one half of this dynamic that I mentioned earlier, and which in the book I call Ludo-Orientalism. In other words, the way, excuse me, the way that games function as a racializing discourse that renders Asianness meaningful as a racial category by characterizing it in gaming terms. So in other words, Asians are those who supposedly play cheap or don't play fair or are inscrutable, uncreative, robotic, allergic to fun, obsessed with work, money, all of those things. And all of those are sort of ludic, or what we'd call kind of game and play related stereotypes. What I found really interesting, though, after looking at these individual texts, is that so many of these Asian racial stereotypes about individuals as, quote unquote, cheap players are also national stereotypes that really dominate the way that US relations with China specifically have been characterized over the last century, but especially now. So the second half of the book is also talking about how gaming has been deployed for the purposes of nation building in an Orientalist fashion, building on Edward Said's term, by defining East and West in opposing relations to these abstract game ideals of fairness and freedom. Because just as these racialized images of individual game players haven't gone away, but have been repackaged and continued to shape the racial imaginary about Asians in America, as those of you who have seen Crazy Rich Asians or follow contemporary esports know. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with those images, that one on the left is an image from the film version of The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan, which is all about mahjong dramatizing intergenerational conflict. And then the most recent is a more infamous scene from Crazy Rich Asians, the mahjong scene. But we also see these kind of much older late 19th century Ludo-Orientalist tropes getting revived in contemporary xenophobia. So in the book, for example, I talk about how the 19th century American narrative of Chinese workers as degenerate gamblers and cheaters, most famously in the poem The Heathen Chinese by Bret Harte, of which this is an image. And essentially the story is of a Chinese laborer, Asin, here he is represented on the right, and the game of euchre, a popular card game at that time, is used to dramatize the fact that Asin's cheap labor is also metaphorized to the fact that he's cheating at the card game. Of course, the satire here is that the Irish-American miners that he's playing against are also trying to cheat him at the same time. It's satire that was unfortunately taken at face value and used to argue for Chinese exclusion. But that image, and that trope of the game became a way to articulate the threat of cheap Chinese labor to the kind of honest American working man. And now, of course, we find it recycled in the dominant narrative where the US as a whole is standing for fairness, right? And China is this rule breaker, counterfeiter, cheat against whom no honest competition is possible. So Ludo-Orientalism for me, on the one hand, is a way of describing the kind of artistic and historical processes where this relationship between gaming, race, and nation gets established. But I also find it really useful as a kind of reading method for games, as a kind of analytical tool to think about how some of these ideas are being transmitted through games themselves. So right now I want to kind of show you some applications of this idea by way of an example, which I hope that many of you still remember. It comes from the summer of 2016, when Pokémon Go, an augmented reality mobile game based on the beloved 1990s Japanese franchise, took America by storm. So initially, though the game was praised for promoting exercise and fostering new friendships, its novel lamination of virtual and real spaces soon exposed more insidious forms of social mapping. Minority players described being the target of suspicious glances while playing in predominantly white neighborhoods. Suburban children were cautioned against straying into so-called bad neighborhoods. An Asian American grandfather, the game's first casualty, but not the last, was shot for alleged trespassing while playing near Virginia Country Club. So many rightly saw these incidents as evidence of the kind of de facto segregation that still defines how race and space are defined in delimited in the United States. So game designers like Omari Akil in this much cited article, Pokemon Go is the death sentence if you are a Black man, rooted the fact that real life inequality shattered that ludic illusion, that magic circle. The idea that racism kind of spoiled the game by making it too real. Because in spite of its cast of adorably cartoonish pocket monsters, that's what the Pokemon stands for, the game counterintuitively provided a really disturbingly realistic approximation of the racial and economic schisms of everyday life. But the question that the book starts with is, was this unwanted intrusion of reality really just an unfortunate contamination, a kind of glitch of the game? Didn't the game, in fact, by making distant travel a necessity, in some sense actually force players into such boundary crossing enterprises? For those of you who haven't played it, the game is basically a kind of like GPS treasure hunt. So you walk around with the game open, and creatures kind of appear on screen in certain locations, and you capture them by kind of clicking, aiming at them with a ball. But the key is that you have to sometimes travel to rather specific locations or quite far away in order to capture the more rare among them, because the goal is to, catch all of them to complete this kind of index. So Akil's observation here that the very premise of the game, quote, asks me as a Black man to put my life in danger if I choose to play it as is intended and with enthusiasm, suggests that Pokemon Go was not simply a reflection of existing white privilege, but actually an active participant in augmenting what we call the reality of racial difference, our sense of race as a socially meaningful sign of human difference, by extending it into the realm of play. So if, as Friedrich Schiller famously remarked, man only plays when in the full meaning of the word he is a man, and he is only completely a man when he plays, then in Pokemon Go, non-white players encountered a kind of, quote, real life Pikachu. It's, as we'll talk about later, kind of superimposed through the camera, and the fact of their own kind of incomplete virtual humanity in the very same moment. Because like the Pokemon themselves, who only appeared on the game map when the player is within sufficiently close range, the social meaning of race activated, is kind of put into play only once players traversed these spatial borders and became very aware of being out of place, being made to feel at once threatened and threatening. So, and this is sort of the premise of the book, that if even a kind of cute, seemingly, quote unquote, colorblind post-racial game like Pokemon Go could be said to play any role in the way that race acquires its meaning in everyday life, then grasping the implications of that kinship requires something that this book is trying to do, a really radical revision of our current assumptions about games as these innocent, apolitical escapes. And the question is kind of further complicated because in a game like Pokemon and Pokemon Go, there may seem to be no visible signs of race. At least this is an image of the Pikachu, at least not in the limited way that we have come to think about that term, through corporeal qualities like skin color, hair, body type, accent, so forth, and especially from within a Black-white binary. And yet, and this is an example of what it means to kind of look at gaming itself as a racializing technology, Pokemon Go's use of GPS and augmented reality, it's the augmented reality that's making it seem like the Pikachu is, standing on the grass through the camera. From another perspective, you could say it's really simply a digital version of a much older racial logic that has served the objectives of imperialism and exploitation for centuries. And this similarity, I think, is nicely illustrated, and because it was the thrust behind Pokemon Go art, like that created by the Aleppo-born photographer, Colette Akil, as a comment on the war in Syria. So what this work highlights, I think, is how the mechanics and dynamics of Pokemon Go, in other words, the game's rules and the kinds of behaviors that it rewards, are, like so many other games, about violent conquest and innocent exploration, not one or the other. In other words, not only does this art bring home how much a game like Pokemon Go resembles these older, what we call world domination games that you may be familiar with, like Risk, but it also renders visible the kind of continuity with contemporary wars. In fact, US military personnel, when the game came out, played Pokemon Go so incessantly that they had to be banned from playing it on base, beginning where else in Pearl Harbor. So beyond the explicit parallels between the kind of imperialist aesthetic and military implications that it draws out, to go back to Akil's images, what they really importantly drive home, I think, is this kind of deceptive logic that makes games like Pokemon Go so compelling. So their force really comes from the dissonance created by superimposing these cute, brightly colored, harmless little cartoon characters against the kind of suffering and devastation that we would actively prefer not to visually apprehend often. And the extremist violence, too, that goes hand in hand with histories of US imperialism. In other words, to take it a kind of step further, Akil's art, like Omari Akil's comments about playing while Black, is revealing what the game itself also already creates, which is the illusion of that dissonance between the pleasure of the game world, these little cartoon characters, and the misery of the real world. And that's how that magic circle that I mentioned earlier is really working, by securing the perception that these two spheres, the game world and the real world, are antithetical, rather than what they are, mutually constitutive. So we can talk about Pokemon Go, and this is just kind of one application of the Ludo-Orientalist kind of reading method. We can talk about it as an imperialist game in the historical sense, in terms of this war, or in the literal sense, given that the whole point of the game is that you, the conqueror, you're encroaching on sovereign territory, you're violently imprisoning the native inhabitants in these little hermetically sealed cages called Pokeballs, and then you're forcing them to fight for you. But what I propose in the book is also an additional layer, which is going beyond seeing a game like this. And there are many, many games like this. I think most recently having something like Animal Crossing come out and be recognized as a kind of lived metaphor for settler colonialism is a really interesting one that, I hope we can talk about more in the Q&A. But beyond seeing just a game like this as a kind of defanged simulation of real life colonization, to recognizing how the interface, the game's location-based technology, also relies on and reproduces forms of colonization. So by location-based technology here, I don't just mean the GPS, that the phone GPS that the game uses, but as I've been saying, that kind of longer analog history of the logic upon which that technology is based. And I think the logic behind Pokemon Go is really nicely exemplified by what Charles Mills, the Jamaican philosopher, called a central part of the racial contract. So Mills was describing this kind of circular reasoning through which non-white subjects get interpolated, right, get defined and made into these things called non-white subjects by colonizing forces. And that reasoning is one which ties together race and space. And it goes like this, in Mills's words: you are what you are, in part because you originate from a certain kind of space. And that space has those properties, in part because it is inhabited by creatures like yourself. So what I find really compelling and fascinating about this explanation, about the way that racialization happens through spatialization and vice versa, is that it's also a really uncannily apt description of the organization of the Pokemon universe. So the 841, well, at that time, actually, 841, there are more now. These Pokemon are divided into what they call elemental types, each of which in Pokemon Go tend to spawn in specific types of places, right? What they call biomes. So in other words, one has a much higher chance of encountering a water type Pokemon near lakes or oceans, while an electric type Pokemon can often be found on college campuses or large dry cities. So we can kind of think about Pokemon Go here essentially encoding the analog colonizing logic of racial spatialization into the digital technology of GPS and augmented reality technology, which drives the game. And this makes a lot of sense too when we consider the kind of development history of Pokemon Go. And we realize that it began life actually as nothing but a Google Maps hoax. So it started in 2014 as one of the April Fool's Day jokes that Google had started annually embedding in its products. And that's tradition that started in 2000 with the release of Mentalplex, a service that supposedly allowed users to search the web telepathically. And I tell the full story of this Pokemon challenge in the book, but essentially using this kind of slickly produced promotional video, and there's some screenshots at the bottom, that showed people traveling to these exotically coded locales using their mobile devices to discover and capture Pokemon. The challenge was essentially a really clever ploy to get users to download the latest version of Google Maps app on their phones. What emerged 2 years later as the actual Pokemon Go was essentially the Google Maps marketing campaign made playable. And it was a collaboration between the Tokyo-based Pokemon Nintendo company and the San Francisco-based Niantic company, Niantic Labs. And the CEO of Niantic, John Hanke, had been a Google Maps employee at the time of that April Fool's joke. In fact, Pokemon Go was really an even more impressive showcase of Google Maps than the original challenge had been, because it demonstrated how GPS navigation technology could be used not just for the mundane purposes of obtaining driving directions or checking real-time traffic conditions, in other words, the kind of work of daily life in the age of smartphones, but also for the purpose of play. It was, after all, the very same smartphone and satellite technology being used to locate the nearest gas station in Google Maps on the one hand, and the nearest cartoon quarry in Pokemon Go on the other. The difference was simply that what had been laminated within a single interface in the Pokemon Challenge, and the challenge was basically, it was kind of crude, static images, just pictures of Pokemon had been pasted essentially onto the Google Maps interface by game developers. So when you updated the Google Maps app for the challenge, you would kind of scroll around and be able to see Pokemon appear in places, and you would capture them just by taking a screenshot. But what had been apparently kind of laminated within a single interface had now been divided into two apparently distinct applications. So the functionality of Google Maps, in other words, was what authorized the kind of location-based fictions that made Pokemon Go so fun. But I say that they were kind of apparently distinct, apparently separated here, because the implications of Google Maps as an authority, what we might call the kind of punchline of the real April Fool's joke, were not apparent until several weeks into the game's release, when concerns about privacy and data mining began to surface. To make a long story short, players' geospatial data, in other words, information about where they'd been, for how long, what speed they were traveling at, so forth, were being actively harvested and monetized. So Pokemon Go was certainly not the first app to use location data to monitor its users' movements, nor to make that information pay in one way by creating in-game incentives that directed players towards particular local businesses, as was the case with the 3,000 McDonald's restaurants in Japan that were converted to Pokemon gyms, or kind of important battling sites, following the fast food chain's national sponsorship of the game. But Pokemon Go was doing more than simply jumping on the kind of lucrative data mining bandwagon, alongside, and the list grows, but innumerable location-based mobile apps, starting with things like Fitbit, Foursquare, Waze, Uber. But in fact, the game is doing something more than that. And in the book, I'm talking about how it's effectively capitalizing on the kind of colonizing logic of capture that, as we've seen, is already inherent to the game itself. In other words, a kind of doubling is happening, where game developers are using the very same GPS technology to track and collect data about players, even as the players themselves used it to track and collect nearby Pokemon. So the true victims of the April Fool Day joke in that sense were the players, who in their own minds saw themselves as these Pokemon masters commanding an army of hapless mercenaries, while they themselves in fact performed hundreds of hours of uncompensated, voluntary, what we call micro labor, in exchange for a quote free-to-play dose of nostalgic fun. So I want to conclude then by kind of bringing back together these two seemingly very different concerns that manifested over Pokemon Go, which replaced the go with the no as a way to, in the minds of their authors, unmask these otherwise hidden forms of surveillance, extraction, and risk in a seemingly innocent game. The concerns that were expressed over data mining and privacy gained a lot more traction in the media and by Niantic was in part because of this colorblind universalizing rhetoric that we're already familiar with, so that the idea of the privacy being breached was the privacy of this kind of abstracted player or user, especially one coded as a child or young person. Indeed, there's a really kind of vicious irony, I think, in recognizing, as Amari Akil and other non-white players did very early on, that the greatest threat that the game posed to the racialized was that it put them in the position of being perceived as the privacy breachers, the trespassers, the rule breakers. So while the fact of Pokemon Go's Asian otherness, in other words, its Japanese origins, receded to effective irrelevance, the racial otherness of bodies like Jiansheng Chen became hyper-visible, hyper-surveilled, hyper-threatening, to the point that the security guard who murdered the 60-year-old Chen for suspected trespassing claimed that he did so out of fear for his own life. So Chen's tragic death, his victimization as this threatening perpetual foreigner, starkly illustrates, I think, how games, far from the myths that we like to tell about them, are really immensely serious sites that can reveal the social dynamics of the real world precisely because they promise to provide us relief from those inequalities. And Pokemon Go, to be clear, is not the only game that does this. In fact, I hope that many more analyses, and I've seen some coming out of this sort, will emerge about all sorts of different games. But the payoff of taking this particular game seriously, though, is I think being able to shine a light on one way that racialization today functions as a location-based augmented reality technology whose violence has been really seamlessly automated into the interface of everyday life. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was fascinating. I guess so. You would like to take questions, I assume, and I guess I could get us started. It's an amazing book, and I think one of the things I like about it is, and this refers to the part that you talked about first, was how this way of reading or interpreting sort of extends the notion of Orientalism as an imaginative geography. You know, that was one of the Said's major claims about Orientalisms, and that wonderfully rich phrase, imaginative geography, and sort of demonstrating how that extends into something that would seem as far from British colonialism as Pokemon Go. And you know, that's fantastic. And then the other part of it, which actually speaks to parts of your book that you didn't refer to as much, was the sort of economic subtext of racial formation, which also comes into play in relation to how games and especially gambling are figured as a kind of racialized formation. And I think the way that you bring those two dimensions of Ludo Orientalism together is just amazing. I guess so one question I had, which is always a question I have about readings of Orientalism, is the differences between different parts of the Orient. Because I know you're working a lot with out of Colleen Lai's work, where, you know, and so which she sort of foregrounds is that the economic is always at the sort of bottom of American forms of Orientalism. But she also distinguishes between Japan, which is and this is early 20th century stuff, right? So Japan gets associated with the sort of technological might, whereas China gets associated with just the sort of sheer size of the markets and productive force that it's, you know what I mean? Like Japan equals technology, China equals size. And so Orientalism gets split, right? And I was wondering if you could think through how, if that's at play in sort of contemporary versions of this ludic Orientalism, because it seems like, I mean, just off the top of my head, like I think you're totally right. Like there's something about Pokemon that seems doesn't seem racial, but there does seem to be a kind of sentimental or orientation toward a lot of consumers toward that Japanese version of gamification technology. Like there's something cute about Japanese versions of gamification, like the whole Nintendo thing. And somehow, even though PlayStation is also Japanese, do you know what I mean? Like there's the cute version and there's the sort of military version, which seems to have a different Orientalist veneer for some reason to me. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but you know what I mean? Like there's a cute Japanese thing that happens versus other versions of gamification that are like sort of more overtly militarized. And that I have a tendency to want to associate with, I don't know. I'm not enough in the game culture to know how to think about that, but it seems to not have that specifically Japanesey, cutesy anime manga thing that sort of Pokemon, Nintendo strain of ludic Orientalism has. You know what I'm saying? And then all the stuff that you're talking about, like with the sort of rhetoric around the South Korean, it's like, isn't it mostly the South Koreans who die from?
Oh, like this idea of gamer death, like playing till
Yeah.
you die. It certainly was, you know, scandalized and dramatized around that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the PC bongs, right? Like so do you know what I mean? That seems like a different strain so anyway, I guess I'm just asking you to think about variegated strains of these various ludic Orientalisms within the context of gaming today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. There's a lot there. One thing I guess I would start with to talk about Pokemon Go is and this is actually something that's been really interesting in more recent discussions about Animal Crossing. You know, also Nintendo, also a game in which, you know, maybe it's just the current moment, but people are much more primed, of course, to recognize the extractive colonialism in it. What's interesting is that many of those readings emphasize it as a moment of European or American empire as the base metaphor, right? Fewer recognize, and this is a reading I do of Pokemon Go in the book, it as a metaphor for Japanese empire, right? And Japanese colonization, and how, in fact, the game might be exportable and satisfying in that way, precisely because it's working on both of these modes of imperialism, right? Whether or not you think of Japanese empire as itself a kind of mimetic imperialism of other forces. But one thing that you're talking about in terms of not just the kind of cuteness of that, but also the smallness, I think is really crucial. And this goes back to what you're talking about in terms of scale, right? There's this way in which what is cute about the Pokemon is this idea of their tininess and their kind of harmlessness, their cartoonishness, in a way that diminishes the threat of empire itself. And also, of course, that, and I didn't talk about this as much today, but something like Pokemon, and this goes back to the original franchise, including the television show, and it's also familiar with things like Sanrio and other histories of Japanese kind of cartoon consumer products, were the result of a very intentional and careful process of localization or glocalization in this sense, where you know, what someone like Iwabuchi has talked about as removing the cultural odor of these things, right? Removing a sense of the Japaneseness so that they seem to be this kind of free-floating cosmopolitan signifiers, seems to me a really central part of the way that this is working in the Japanese context. What I think is interesting, and you know, I think you rightly point to China as the other end of the spectrum, in terms of not just a less elegant or less innocent version of gamification, but one that is also kind of crudely focused on efficiency and the market. So in the book, I talk about gold farming, which is basically virtually harvesting currency in game and then selling it for real world currency, and it continues today. But that idea was very much vilified as a kind of Chinese malady, and one in which kind of brute forcing was ruining the pleasure of a game by turning it into a market. But I think South Korea, as you point out, is really interestingly positioned kind of in the middle, but also moving towards the Japanese side in the sense that the US finds it far more palatable, right? So following the 1997 financial crisis, something like esports, which is basically, you know, competitive spectator sport video game playing, took off in South Korea, partially because of the imposition of a broadband structure and an investment in the telecommunications industry that looks actually much more familiar to the Japanese development of what we'd call techno-orientalism in the 80s and 90s. So I think very much that there's a kind of a cuteness, a smallness, a cleanness associated with certain forms of East Asian, but specifically Japanese and South Korean and Singaporean actually gaming that we see consistently sort of set up as an internal binary too. I hope that kind of gets to some of what you were talking about.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Are you moderating questions, or I don't know if there are questions in the chat, but
So far there aren't, but it's up to you. Would you like to just call on folks, or do you want me to take care of that, or it's up to you?
Yeah, feel free to go ahead if there are any.
So we have a question in the chat from Chris Rose. Can you see that, Tara?
I can. It says the premise is not so much about game theory per se, but about the fact that the fitness landscape is constructed according to game maker values. Would Chris feel comfortable expanding on that question a little? I'd love to hear what they're thinking. And I'm not sure if we can unmute people or how that works. Okay. So Chris doesn't have audio right now. I think that the question is sort of pertaining to how gamification in fitness, in other words, the creation of these quantified goals, right? Hitting 10,000 steps, or even gamifying fitness. As you recall, there were these things called like Zombie Run, where there were apps that would sort of give you the sense that you were running away from zombies in order to get your, daily steps or get your heart rate up. How those are constructed according to the valuation of games. And I mean, I think that this is a really interesting topic about gamification, because it's one in which, yes, exactly, also Peloton, the way in which gamification emphasizes the way in which game and real world, if they were ever as cleanly distinguished as we might like to think, in fact, are very much interconnected in the name of a kind of neoliberal and consumer capitalism mode. And so it's been really interesting, I think, to follow these in all sorts of ways, because the whole idea behind Pokemon, the idea that you would travel to a McDonald's and then be able to get a kind of virtual reward, was in some sense not very new at all, right? There were these ideas of Yelp badges and challenges and all sorts of ways in which we had already been kind of inculcated into that mode of interacting with technology and with space. I think it's been interesting too, from a teaching perspective, to see how gamification has been experimented with in education as a way to motivate students to, and yet at the same time, maybe to mitigate a reliance on grades and focus more on effort, right? Because the idea behind games, the positive way of looking at a lot of games, is that failure doesn't mean the end, right? It's a new learning experience. So it's been really interesting to see the way that gamification has been kind of unevenly applied in different realms. Oh, I think I see another question here. I think this first one is from Celine, and it says, can you talk more about Animal Crossing as another game paralleling colonialism? It's posed as such a wholesome escape, a cottagecore aesthetic that many people use as a break from a capitalist world. Yeah, thanks for that question. It's interesting because one thing I talked about less here, even though I talked about the cuteness, is the kind of aesthetic of Animal Crossing. And for some reason, it's that aesthetic that has sort of put me off Animal Crossing. So I can't speak about it in as much detail as maybe others can here in terms of the specific things that you do. But I think the idea is that the game is simulating the kind of colonialist rhetoric in the sense that you're entering this quote unquote deserted island, right? And this idea of uninhabited kind of virgin territory where you stake your flag and you begin your enterprise there is a very familiar one, right? And then you plant trees, harvest those trees, get other resources, sell those resources, get more money, use the money, reinvest it into them. So what I found really interesting, I think, is that when I was looking online, you find many ways, as I've said, in which people have already read Animal Crossing as colonialist, but there are also some which try to think about how you can be anti-colonialist, how you can resist that through your gameplay. And that's been really interesting to me because I think that echoes a larger discourse that's happening outside the game, which is how can we change the game from within it, right? Is there any way to do that? So some of the anti-colonial suggestions for players are like, always pick up the trash, the detritus of things that are on the ground. Give the things, that you harvest to the museum instead of selling them to Tom Nook, the quote unquote owner of these islands, for more resources. And I think it really does beg the question there of whether that's a break from the capitalist world, as many people rightly feel soothed and relaxed by it. I totally understand the appeal of those games, and I continue to play them myself. But whether that's a break for them or whether it's just a more perfect simulation of it that makes you feel like you have some control either over it because you are the idealized capitalist, or that you are able to resist it in more explicit ways. I mean, I think that's also why Animal Crossing has been a very interesting site to explore things like protest in games. So especially during the Hong Kong protests, they would have in-game protests, where people would gather and then create sort of little funerals in games. And so, yeah, I think that Animal Crossing is such a rich and interesting one. But also, I'm also been really curious thinking about things like the Oregon Trail, right? Like, why is that game one that was packaged as sort of educational and one that framed a lot of the probably first video game experience for a whole generation of 1980s school children, myself included. What does it mean when there are simulations of settler colonialism that are just literal, right? Like you're not playing an animal entering a deserted island, you're quite literally recreating the historical travel in a wagon train. So I think that those are some really interesting questions it brings up. And then I see a question here from Jason Lee that says, I have a question about mechanism. You talked about how the environment of Pokemon Go comes to reinforce the surrounding racial forces within the game. Can you elaborate on what you think might be the mechanism that allowed the game to reinforce the ideas? In other words, what work was performed on the game that resulted in that reinforcement? So I think if I'm understanding Jason's question correctly, and feel free, please, to elaborate, by audio, a lot of it has to do with this kind of external marketing, right? That is being done that's invisible to the consumer. And one of the ways in which things that were changed, you could see before the game Go, and again, going back to the franchise, is the use of language. So the changing of names to make them appear less foreign. So all of the Japanese names, not all of them, many of the Japanese names of these individual creatures was changed to make them still make sense within an American context, to capture, let's say, the feeling, of a particular character, but also to erase any kind of threatening signs of foreignness. And the ones that were left, like something like Pikachu, is left, according to the developers and the localizers, precisely because there didn't seem to be anything Japanese about them. The idea is that to an Anglophone audience, an English-speaking audience, English-reading audience, those words would sound like nonsense. It actually means something like electric mouse, or the sound that a mouse would make. And Pikachu is electric, right? So one of the ways I think is in that very careful packaging and exporting. But then secondly, as we were going back to saying, one of the ways I think that may have made that game palatable and allowed the game to reinforce those ideas is this seeming erasure at the level of language, at the level of body, and at the level of Japanese history, this history of empire that is kind of embedded within it. I hope that kind of addresses the question.
If I can very quickly elaborate.
Oh, please, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I realize actually your answer is still very valid. And I wasn't even thinking about it in that context. I was actually thinking about the mapping element, which is what I probably should have clarified. But yeah, I like that part to me. I think was very, very interesting to think about. If there was some sort of like alternative mapping, right? Like the way that we use, racialized maps as a whole are a big and complicated subject. I'm curious if there like is some sort of imaginary for like a Pokemon Go map that would not have had those types of embedded ideas within them, and if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, this is a big and really interesting question, because one of the ways that you can think about, as you said, like racialized mapping and especially geography as a form of settling and silencing, but also fixing things in place, has such a long history, right? In the same way that many of the early globes or maps that we encountered in childhood are ones in which North America just happened to be the center of the world, right? So American exceptionalism realized in mapping. And so it goes back, I think, to that same question of how alternative mapping, like anti-colonial actions within Pokemon, are possible. And I think people have done really interesting things thinking about how not the mapping interface, but the kinds of things that are considered landmarks or relevant on the map might be a way to kind of disrupt that hegemonic logic. So a lot of the landmarks that are embedded into Pokemon before the, let's say, like McDonald's sponsorship, et cetera, were ones that actually pre-existed the game and were part of this game called Ingress, which Niantic had made. And it was a kind of more sci-fi themed, I suppose, kind of geocaching game. And it was a similar idea that you would travel using your phone and locate certain landmarks. And so the things, of course, there that were considered landmarks are those that fit also into that racialized geographic and colonial history, right? Museums or certain ideas of what is considered historical, what is considered significant. And so I think being able to uncover that secondary level of what is considered important, what is considered serious as history is an interesting way of thinking about how you might reconsider that mapping element. And then I see, should I read it, Dan, or do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll read it. And this question is from Christine, and it says, following up on Dan's opening question, your response, a comment, I wonder if another way into Pokemon Go as a case study in the racialization of space and the player that frames colonialist capture of cute or kawaii creatures might be through Wendy Lee's reading of Gremlins as Asian American before they transform. Yeah, this is great. You know, this is, for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, and Christine, maybe you can clarify too, because it's been a little while since I read and saw Wendy's piece on this, but is the way in which in the film Gremlins, these creatures are actually those that are bought at kind of, what, like a wet market, or like in Chinatown, this kind of like mysterious, you know, highly orientalized space. And yet the fact that they are Asian American in the sense that they don't sort of manifest those bodily qualities is part of the conceit of it. And Wendy's reading of it really brings that back in a really central way. But you know, Christine, can you remind me maybe about the central argument there? Because I think I'm missing something important. Oh, I think you're muted. Can I unmute people, or can they unmute them? Can you?
Sorry,
okay.
I ended up
okay.
turning my video on instead of unmuting my mic. So yes, they are actually bought at this very stereotypical Chinatown shop, and you know, they're asking what this creature is. They're given a Chinese word, but he ends up renaming it. And I think part of it is before these gremlins then become like these like monstrous black caricatures, they are these like constantly replicating cute things. And that Wendy's argument is that in sort of reading these gremlins, you know, before they become monstrous black caricatures as Asian American, that she in reading them that way, she's able to sort of see the kind of ambivalence around Asian Americans as model minorities, but there is this like intense sort of fungibility to these creatures that just sort of keep replicating in their cuteness. And so I wonder if there isn't something about the like cuteness of the Pokemon creatures that whether or not we can read that as, I wonder if there's a way in which we can read that within a landscape of US racialization, which, while I think that, you know, you reference these incidents of like racist violence that Pokemon Go maps as like, as not just in the US, but I wonder if within the sort of, or actually maybe even transnationally, whether there is a way in which we might think about racialization in that way, that sort of, while at the same time there is both like Japanese empire and then there's also like US-China relations, that what Asian American racialization might then do to these racial maps. I mean, I guess that's my question, or if that's another way into this question of cuteness, or objects that aren't human representations that are nonetheless racial representations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that, you know, it's a really interesting question to think about how non or subhumanness in the relationship, or in relationship to Asian racialization, looks quite different, maps quite differently onto bodies coded as Asian compared to how that idea maps onto other racial groups. And there's certainly something about this, you know, this racialized Asian body, or however we want to call it, cutified body, that is kind of constantly sliding between, as you describe, a kind of idealized, sterilized, safe white space and a monstrous, threatening black space, right? And what I talk about in the book too, and I think Akil talks about this a little bit in his article, is that the experience of being kind of out of place being hypervisible and invisible at the same time is one of spatial dislocation that is, of course, very familiar to Asian racialization. I mean, I think also thinking about the creatures themselves, right, even though they look many different ways, thinking about the creatures themselves as a kind of standing metaphor for the ways in which Asian Americans have been seen as both invisible and hypervisible according to particular lenses that are put onto them and in relation to particular kinds of racialized backdrops, or those that are seen as a-racialized, is a really useful and interesting way to think about it. I hope that kind of got it at what you were referencing, because I think it's a really useful lens.
She says, yes, thank you very much. So much. I think we have time for one last question.
So it looks like there's a question here, yeah. What role has the ongoing dialectic between law and race played? Is that Rui, am I reading your question correctly there? I'd love to, if you want to elaborate on it.
Yeah, this is, I'm Portuguese. I was writing in my hand the foot process in Portuguese, but this is during your speech, you talk about game theory, etc. But did you think about this relation, this dialectic about law, race, because the law is, the intention from the law is to bring justice to the society, but this controversy between praxis and the theory means that there is a vacuum. How do you think about this dialectic? Because as we see, especially in the United States with the Afro-American, how the law or the jurisprudence from the law try to put out the Afro-American from the common goods, from the democracy to take also. How you see this dialectic in your argument? This is
yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I hope that I think there's a number of different ways to go about it. What I think has been interesting in the book, especially looking at earlier periods, is thinking about how games and game rules, especially for those who are excluded or disenfranchised by the law, become a kind of alternate way of litigating unfairness, right? Or litigating exclusion. So one of the chapters is especially thinking about how, moving away from the kind of video game moment, how gambling, right? And Las Vegas as a sign of this, but gambling games in relationship to chance generally might be a way to kind of achieve the equality or a sense of justice, fairness, that cannot be achieved within the law. And of course, one of the ways we see this is in terms of something like immigration law. But in one of the chapters I talk about too, how Japanese mass incarceration during World War II is one in which, so game theory here tries to anticipate and respond to what the US government's expectations of Japanese American loyalty is, right? So they gave them this infamous loyalty questionnaire in which they asked, would you be willing to serve in the armed forces? And would you be willing to, kind of forswear all allegiance to the emperor? And so in the face of those kind of impossible legal questions that would lead to becoming a stateless person, right? Giving up your citizenship for those Japanese immigrants who were not and could not be American citizens by law. The logic of games, the idea of a kind of prisoner's dilemma game in which you try to answer based on what you think they think you're going to answer, became really central to narrating that experience and kind of making sense out of a kind of impossible choice. So that's one of the ways, it's a couple of different ways in which I had been thinking about law. But one final comment on that is to say that the term, the race card, is one that really entered the the more recent, it's actually a much older term, but the more recent kind of dialectic with the O.J. Simpson trial, right? And the idea that OJ's legal team was talking about kind of winning by playing the race card, supposedly instrumentalizing race by putting it into play as an unfair advantage that would sentimentalize the jurors to be able to act outside of the law, right? To institute a totally different set of rules for evaluating the guilt of OJ, and one in which the legal team later expressed, feelings of guilt in taking that route. Interestingly.
Well, thank you so much, Tara. That was wonderful. Could everybody join me in thanking Tara for her wonderful talk?
Yeah, thank you all for those wonderful questions too.
Soraya, do you want to say anything to say goodbye to everybody?
Nope, we're all set. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.